Welcome back to the podcast, guys. So, today we are going to be talking about somebody I really admire as an artist. And I hope you saw the warnings on this video before you clicked on it. We are going to talk about difficult subjects as well around mental health, like depression and ending one's life. And I think it's really important for you, if you're not quite ready to listen about that, just to don't watch this video, don't listen to this podcast. But if you feel like you're ready and you feel like you can handle that, or if you feel like you won't be triggered, I hope you enjoy it. And I did a ton of research on this, so hopefully this video won't be too long. But let's dive right in. So when I set out to speak publicly about my own struggles with mental health and depression that I've had in the past and what helped me in my adventures into the mind, I realized that when you go deeper into your own personal psychology and understand the complexity of the human psyche and its nature, you in a way become interconnected with everyone else because you understand other humans as well. It's a strange paradox, but I assure you it works. However, I feel like sometimes to understand humanity, you have to be open to hear another person's story to truly connect to the collective mind. And I would like to proceed forward with caution and with a lot of compassion for the soul we're about to discuss here, and with compassion and kindness for the souls that this one has left behind. So, speaking of paradoxes, this is the story of Kurt Cobain, wrapped in a blanket of stars and constellations. I hope you enjoy this one. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on the 20th of February 1967 in a hospital on a hill overlooking Aberdeen, Washington. His parents lived in neighboring Hoquiam, but it was appropriate that Aberdeen stand as Kurt's birthplace. He would spend 3/4 of his life within 10 miles of the hospital and would be forever profoundly connected to this landscape. Anyone looking out from Grace Harbor Community Hospital that rainy Monday would have seen a land of harsh beauty where forests, mountains, rivers, and a mighty ocean intersected in a magnificent vista. Tree-covered hills surrounded the intersection of 3 rivers, which fed into the nearby Pacific Ocean. In the center of it all was Aberdeen, the largest city in Grace Harbor County, with a population of 19,000. Immediately to the west was smaller Hoquiam, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, where Kurt's parents, Don and Wendy, lived in a tiny bungalow. And south across the Chehalis River was Cosmopolis, where his mother's family, Fredenbergs, were from. On a day when it wasn't raining, which was a rare day in a region that got over 80 inches of precipitation a year, one could see the 9 miles to Montesano, where Kurt's grandfather Leland Cobain grew up. It was a small enough world with so few degrees of separation that Kurt would eventually become Aberdeen's most famous product. What I've just read to you is the first paragraphs of the first chapter to Charles R. Cross's take on Kurt Cobain's biography called Heavier Than Heaven. And if you're interested more in Kurt Cobain, I do highly recommend for you guys to read that. It is a beautifully written book. And the image that Cross portrays for us in the first chapters of Cobain biography drew up a picture of gloom, economically depleted, cold environment post-America's golden era. Depressive art. So as you can see here on the screen is his birth chart of that day and that time of his birth. A boy born with a Virgo ascendant 23 degrees, 23 minutes in conjunction with Uranus and Pluto. While Uranus sits pretty much exactly on his ascendant at Virgo 23, Pluto is a little bit behind at 19 degrees. The Chandra symbol for 24 degrees Virgo, always round up the Chandra symbols. And if you don't know what Chandra symbols are, it's just another way. There's also Sabian symbols, but it's just another way to read degree astrology. And you kind of read them like tarot cards or oracle cards. So I'll read this one up to you. So the Chandra symbol for 24 degrees Virgo is a silver trident. And here's how it reads. Standing for something, publicly, openly, freely showing conviction, vision, attunement to the whole, making a big issue out of seeing and knowing what we all need to get in touch with, making sure nobody can get away with ignoring or avoiding the truth at hand. Granted a distinctive point of view that is fundamentally innocent, naive, hopeful, visionary, and empowering. Bearing the ideal of what is intended, what is possible, what is emergent. Given the assignment to show that we can understand and champion the best, the finest, the truest of our nature. And did Kurt do that for us? Did he show us that we need to do better as society? Did he point to our flaws? His punk ideals are a reminder that we do often focus on the wrong things, and over 30 years after his passing, in some ways, we're no better. Nirvana became one of the best-selling music bands in all history, and yet throughout his whole life, Kurt has only ever owned one car. He didn't chase riches, and he felt almost a disgust towards his popularity. He was a man chasing art. So let's finish this Chandra symbol so we can analyze it. Propelled to insist, to stand strong, to hang in there. Fundamentally uncompromising and unimpressed. Sounds like Kurt. Just knowing that certain things must get across, and it really doesn't matter if it hurts or who likes it. Or whatever the self is seen as marvelous or terrible. That definitely sounds like Kurt. Creating art despite love or hate. Great dispassion in our perspective. Standing back alone, yet played through by the invisible. Is this an indication that there are higher powers standing by this Chandra symbol? I think there's one behind every Chandra symbol, but anyway. To the greatest possible extent. Inspired, guided, given explicit instructions by those who know and care. Entrusted with crucial matters. Chosen to carry things through, perhaps even knowing of expanded facilities, source, the ultimate level, definitely shown what needs to be seen when it is time. Possessed of a lofty spirit, character that is impregnable, and to me that's impregnable with ideas. A remarkable way to be in dark times. Just not adaptive to fashion, to what is popular, to what is decreed practical. And, one of the examples of this is Kurt was definitely a trendsetter. And one of the notable things about Nirvana coming along is the way they change how bands are supposed to look. There's less flair, more casual clothes, and whilst Kurt at times loved to dress up and poke fun at the rock bands of the bygone era, most of the time he just wore jeans and a sweater. This is more of the Chandra symbol. Principles, guidelines, the vertical. Able to stay aligned with the greater cosmic truth and speak for this, yet much of it is silent, evocative. More of a vigil than a battle cry. It is simply there to spread the news that spirit will prevail inevitably. Like, wow. Wow, incredible. It is something to sit with, so if you want to listen to it again, just rewind, because there's a lot of packed in it. But I just wanted to mention really quickly an example of someone who has the exact same AC and that's Ryan Reynolds. And whatever you think of Reynolds, or whatever you think he's a good person or bad person, you can see a slight parallel to what's happening to Reynolds now and the hate that he's receiving with Kurt when he was at the peak of popularity. And him and Courtney both received a lot of negativity, bad press, due to them being on drugs, especially after they had a baby. And that's all I'm going to mention about that for now. Let's move on. This Virgo, this 23-degree Virgo rounded up to 24 Chandra symbol, the silver trident that we just read, represents AC and Uranus in Kurt's chart respectively. But what do these symbols actually symbolize? What do these symbols symbolize? What do they actually mean, ascendant and Uranus? So the ascendant, as it pertains in evolutionary astrology, and the way in which I resonate with it, is not just how the world sees us. I don't really believe it to be the first impressions of who we are as a personality, although it might slightly pertain to our look and style, and the reason is that AC is who we are trying to become in this lifetime. For instance, Kurt was not a Virgo sun. He was born under a Pisces sun, capable of easily losing himself in his fantasies and illusions, but his soul craved to have a more mercurial approach to life, grounded in skill, grounded in art, and a desire to understand language and how it is used to evoke certain emotions. The ascendant is not who we are as we come into this world from the womb of our mothers. It is who our soul craves to become. In the words of Dane Rudhyar, the ascendant symbolizes the very essence of self, man's attitude and path towards himself. And Carl Jung called this process of individuation, or the path to wholeness. So in the short time that Kurt was with us, I think he really truly succeeded in embodying the Virgo self, the Virgo attitudes. Although when we observe the chart with close curiosity, it is clear that if Kurt would have lived his entire Uranus cycle, we might have seen his mercurial genius manifest on a whole new level that we can imagine. But here, I think we're jumping ahead a little bit. So let's move on to Uranus for now. And Uranus is often referred to as a planet that represents the inner genius, which some people are lucky to find in their lifetime. And everybody has Uranus in their charts. And all of us possesses a genius of one form or another. And being that Uranus is placed right on Kurt's ascendant, it is no surprise that he's often recognized and considered still a lyrical genius of his generation. And Virgo stands for lyrics, and Uranus stands for genius, and you can't make this stuff up. And I know that Pluto's on a different degree than the placements, but we're discussing, but the god of the underworld, Pluto, is in close proximity to enough to create a stellium and add potency and power to the placement that we have just discussed. And then we have Neptune in the third house, sextiling the stellium in Virgo pretty much perfectly. And the way I see this, the sextile, which is one of the aspects in astrology, is spurts of inspiration that are born from despair. Neptune in Scorpio represents that, and frustration, Scorpio, about the events that are happening with the hand's reach. Third house, so our neighborhood, our mind, the close proximity of the natal. And mad genius, Uranus conjunct Pluto, creating, sextile, inspired by art, Neptune, and injustice of the world, Scorpio.
Just 1 second, guys. I think my leg fell asleep, so it really definitely did fall asleep. I'll just sort it out while we're recording. Let's not pause it for this.
Anyway, now we also have Vesta, and she's nestled on the same degree, 24 Scorpio, as Neptune, creating a conjunction with the previously mentioned. Here's what Dimitra George says about this combination in her book, Goddesses. The focusing principle combined with the transcendent urge. This combination emphasizes a devotion to spiritual or artistic ideals. Harmonious aspects denote a depth of compassion that can lead one to participate as a universal world server. There may be a long-term commitment to a spiritual path or a focused devotion to the fine arts. I think it to be important to mention that Neptune matures later in life, and there's a potential that we would see more of an obvious commitment to spiritual path from Kurt if he lived to an older age. Of course, that is uncertain. But what is certain is that the man was absolutely devoted to the arts. And a trained eye and ear can observe that he was highly influenced by various writers, various painters, and musicians. Now, hold on. Let me just take a sip of my tea and breathe for a second. I'd like to draw our attention now to Kurt's Jupiter in Cancer, which happens to sextile his ascendant, making his Jupiter a supportive force in the soul's aim for wholeness. Jupiter is also the ruler of his sun in Pisces, meaning that Kurt's vitality, his life force, the core of who he was, is best expresses itself through nurture, Cancer, of the community, the 11th house. At the time, Kurt might have not thought that the art that he's creating is particularly nurturing, but he did become the voice of his generation and spoke to the pain of Generation X. It might be hard for the younger generations to believe, but prior the 90s, speaking of feelings or emotions was considered basically taboo. I truly do believe that Kurt healed people for his music and art. He didn't just heal his soul, but his community as well. I also want to quickly mention the squares to Kurt's ascendant without dwelling too much on these placements. The first square is the galactic center, which indicates that oftentimes Kurt stood in his own way when creating. Even when his art came to him from the divine, he felt the need to doubt himself and sometimes question himself. It's almost as if he needed someone else's art as a backbone to support his ideas. I need some water. The next square is the MC conjunct Ceres in Gemini. So the ascendant Uranus-Pluto square to Sirius indicates a crisis of communication. Both Virgo and Gemini indicate a need and a desire to be talked to and listened to, as well as we will see in his biography. Kurt did not get the nurture or the nurturing attention every child deserves. As an adult, I imagine that Kurt had a hard time expressing what he needs in words, and even though his intention might have been caring, he wasn't able to come across that way. According to Dimitra George, Sirius in Gemini also indicates that love was given conditionally, based upon the performance or achievement of the child. Anyway, so the AC, Uranus and Pluto, oppose Kurt's stellium in Pisces. Saturn, Venus, Chiron, and Mercury are all there. The sun is also in Pisces, but because it's in the first decan, it doesn't actually create that, or is not included in that stellium. I just realized I keep using the word stellium, and for those of you who are new to astrology, might need a little definition. So stellium is when planets are conjunct one each other, and it's more than 2 planets, it's 3 planets. And this combination of planets feed into one another's energy, and blend together to create a unique expression. So the first placement that jumps out for me is Kurt's Chiron in Pisces. And Chiron corresponds to the wounded healer in us all, a pain that we must transcend within ourselves first, and once Chiron matures in our charts, we can help others heal the same pain. So let's talk about pain a bit more. T-Man in Astrology and the Art of Healing refers to Virgo ascendant as related to digestive problems. And Uranus in Virgo represents abdominal cramps, bowel cramps, spasmodic intestinal pains. Kurt talked about the immense stomach pains he lived with and compared that. He was not compared. I can't read my own. It's not even my own writing. It's typed. Let me just say that again. Kurt talked about the immense stomach pains and complained that he was in constant pain throughout his life. You can hear it in his interviews as well. What was really upsetting about Kurt's gastro problems is that the medicine at the time didn't really look at diet as much, or even perhaps they did look at psychosomatic causes that have been present. And that's a real shame, because I feel like he might have just been allergic to something. He might have had a gluten intolerance or even been celiac. And I suppose they did test for celiac and all of that. But still, I feel like more could have been done. Anyway, moving on. Now, to Pisces. Because it rules our imagination, but also illusions and delusions, often also represents drugs and addiction problems. Pisces stands for the world we want to get lost in. To put all this together, the Virgo stellium opposing the Pisces stellium is Kurt's attempt to balance the pain that he lived with the pleasure. And I think this is a really important point that, some of the other analysis of Kurt's life that I read or watched really missed is that he wasn't just in mental anguish. He was pretty much in constant physical pain. And if you've ever suffered from any chronic illness or long-term disease, you would understand that physical pain can cause mental anguish as well. And yes, of course, he carried deep pain from his childhood and possibly ancestral trauma too, but I feel like that had to be mentioned. So let's move on to the ruler of Kurt's chart. There are a few different ways that astrologers identify the ruler of the chart, and one of them is to go by the sun. Others, I actually don't know what other astrologers do, but the way I look at the ruler is by going by the ascendant, and the ascendant in Virgo here rules Mercury in Pisces. Also, if you see me looking here, I know the chart is on the screen for you, but it's here for me. Okay. So the ascendant in Virgo rules Mercury, which is in Pisces. And I recently took a class with my mentor, Adam Sommer, and he spoke about Dane Rudger's interpretation of the Mercury cycle as it pertains to the native progressed Mercury. I couldn't find the specific writings in reference to Rudger's ideas, that's why I'm referring to my class, but from my understanding, when Mercury's in the natal chart and is coming close to the conjunction in the sun, sorry, that wasn't right. When Mercury is by progression in the natal chart and is coming, actually no, let me reread that. But when Mercury is in the natal chart is coming to a close conjunction to the sun, it usually indicates that person is born with some sort of idea or creation he or she needs to put forward into the world. And soon after they're born, their Mercury goes retrograde by progression, and by the time it goes direct, the native has discovered and manifested what it is that they want to create, their magnum opus, so to speak. And in Kurt's Mercury has sped up nearly 20 degrees away from his sun by the time he was born, but still, I was curious to see if there was anything significant that he created by the time his Mercury progressed and went direct. He's progressed Mercury went direct. And lo and behold, August 4th, 1991, Kurt's Mercury goes direct, and on the 27th of August, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Nirvana's most popular song, to this day, and one that I think kind of launched the band to stardom, although I now believe it's the album, really, Nevermind, that launched it into stardom, but really the music video helped. And it played on the radio for the very first time on the 27th of August, so I think it's a phenomenal coincidence, and I believe that Mercury cycle, by progression, needs to have a revision, because I don't know many people who seriously study Mercury besides maybe Gary P. Caton. And if you guys want me to explain to you what progressions are in a different video, let me know. But I don't want to get distracted here. I want to change the trajectory of our reading now, and we can finally start and focus on Kurt's biography as it pertains to his chart. So despite being born into a family who struggled financially, the first few years of Kurt's life, according to the information available, was pretty normal, peaceful, and one could even say happy. However, right before Kurt's 10th birthday, his parents, Wendy and Don, decide to divorce, and that single event changes Kurt's life forever. I think every child reacts to their parents' divorce differently, but you guys got to remember that even though in our day and age divorce is common and widely mentioned on the media or in conversations, back in the 70s, divorce was still frowned upon. And for a child especially who's very sensitive, it would not only be confusing news, but might even feel like the end of their world. And it was the end of a certain world. It's the ending, beginning of another. And as such, this was the end of the world as Kurt knew it. On top of that, from the announcement of Don and Wendy's separation, Don moving out of the family home was like less than a month. Let's continue. So March 1st of 1976, the day Don moved out and into his own apartment. So Charles R. Cross writes in Kurt's biography, this wasn't a divorce. It was war, filled with hatred, spite, and revenge of a blood feud. To Kurt, it was emotional holocaust. No other single event in his life had more of an effect on shaping his personality. And that's why I think it's really important for us to look at this chart. Astrologically, what is really significant about the day Don Cobain moves out is that Kurt is experiencing his first Saturn trine here. Saturn transits his natal Jupiter in Cancer, while the moon is in Pisces, the day, and transits his stellium, including Saturn, that we have already mentioned. One thing I have noticed about Jupiter in Cancer is that often natives with that signature are sensitive to words, lyrics of songs, and even write music themselves, perhaps to process their own emotions, although Kurt would never admit to that even when he was alive. We see the same signature in the charts of Taylor Swift, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Liberace, Billie Eilish, SZA, Jerry Garcia, John Mayers, Sam Cooke, Paul McCartney, Hozier, Billy Corgan, Logic, and Zedd, to name but a few. And whether you like these artists or not, there is music in their pain. And I didn't say pain, the music, I said there's music in their pain. Not everyone who has Jupiter in Cancer becomes like a lyrical genius or a musician for that matter. But those who do can transcend their own suffering by soothing their own pain with a melody, a sound, a poetry that speaks to the same suffering in the hearts of humanity. This is one of the biggest clues in Kurt's chart as to why his music speaks to so many. Nay, I would even say sounds familiar even decades after his passing. He wasn't merely a lyrical genius. He was a healer, leading us back into our own hearts. And his parents' divorce, that single event, has activated his Saturn-Jupiter trine in a way that is undeniable, the source of his inspiration and the cause of the aching of his soul. We're used to being taught that trines are positive and squares are negative in astrology. And we overlook that all aspects have positive and negative sides. The positives that I see from this trine is Kurt's ability for completion of his creative endeavors, his ability to sit down and finish a song or a painting and complete it while getting lost in the process. Then there's Uranus transiting his natal south node, or K2, in Scorpio right after Kurt had his first nodal opposition. The nodal opposition often indicates one chapter in our life ending, whether we like it or not, to launch us into a new season of our lives, and that happens to us every 9 years. Uranus on the notes indicates an unexpected, perhaps even shocking event that lights up a fresh mindset or mentality. Third house for Kurt. If you believe in past lives, the South Node often refers to talents, memories, and even stories that are left over from the previous life that we need to work on in this lifetime. 1 second, sorry. I actually just need to breathe. God, I forget to do that. That happens to you guys when you speak. I just need to take a breath. And for some reason, I really want to smudge right here. I think there's a lot of sadness in this particular subject. A lot of grief and a lot of loneliness. But where were we? The nodal opposition. So if you believe in past lives, the South Node usually refers to those memories, talents, and stories that we bring from previous lives. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a past life, but it's easier to refer to that here. You know, the way Jung described it is memories from the collective consciousness too. So you can look at it that way as well, if past lives is uncomfortable for you. And Scorpio might also speak about blame and shame, especially the kind we inflict on ourselves. And Kurt might have felt that the divorce was his fault. In a way, his parents' divorce woke up a new feeling of anger in him. When he was 10, he wrote on his bedroom wall, "I hate mom, I hate dad, dad hates mom, mom hates dad. It simply makes you want to be so sad." Already 10 years old, already a poet. And children of divorce often do feel like it's their fault, especially like I said, when divorce is still fresh in media and fresh for people and not as common. The progressed moon was also in Scorpio, transiting his natal Neptune, trining Saturn and Jupiter that we already mentioned, and approaching the progressed moon square with his natal sun. The grand trine is an indicator that this event served as an inspiration for his art. But the other transits that we've already mentioned, such as Uranus and Scorpio, transit the South Node. Saturn transit natal Jupiter, were the beginning of Kurt's mental struggles and even struggles with his health. Post his parents' divorce, the first time that Kurt ended up in the hospital due to his stomach pains and potential malnutrition, he was starved of love and he starved himself of nutrients. He also developed a strange twitching in his eye around that time. That is safe to say that he was severely stressed. And so 3 months after his parents' divorce, Kurt has moved with his father and even changed schools, where he became a popular kid. From everything I have read, things seem to have stabilized for Kurt for a short period of time, but when I look at the charts and I see Saturn transiting his 12th house in Leo, I can't help but think that he was lonely in his newfound popularity, and perhaps it's that feeling of loneliness he associated with being popular. On one hand, popularity met some of his needs, but then on the other hand, it made him even more disconnected than he already was. I also want to mention quickly that the relationship that his mother began right after the divorce was with a violent man who wasn't, and it is a theme that runs for his songs, like, I don't think I'm allowed to say that here, but I think I'll just blurt it out, and Polly are the two I found. If you guys find more, but it's definitely a really deep theme in his music and his art. Let's move on. 1979, Kurt joined the school band as its drummer. That year, his progressed moon was moving from the 5th house, and it's the house of our creativity. It's the house of our hobbies, our interests, our romance, flings and flirtations and such. And his is in Capricorn, the sign that indicates the metaphorical mountains our soul longs to climb in this lifetime. This is an interesting thing to mention because it marks the beginning of his understanding of what it's like to be part of the band, learning musical skills, etc. And what's fascinating about this is that Kurt didn't just become obsessed with music, he was obsessed with creating a band, and that year I think marks the seed of his obsession. Since Moon is related to emotions, home environment, and how safe we feel in our own body, it is also important to note that Kurt didn't always feel comfortable at home. His father remarried to a woman who had 2 children and of her own, and Kurt always felt that he was treated less fairly than the other children. It's the progressed Moon making an opposition to his natal Moon that piques my interest around that story. As if Kurt is getting the opposite of what his internal emotions and safety needs are, and the astrology shows his feelings were absolutely valid. At the same time, this discomfort pushes him to explore art in all its forms. He's playing drums in a band, he's imitating comics and making jokes, he's drawing and doodling all the time. Like, his art was amazing, and I just want to show you a couple of the pieces from that time because as a child, he was really showing more of potential for visual artistry rather than musician. That came when he was a little bit older. Excuse me. And this one is a difficult one, and I want to mention something in a very compassionate way. Something I keep reading about, that Kurt, as a child, was obsessed with the idea of ending one's life. I don't think it's fair to put that on Kurt as well. He was a member of Gen X. I often joke that this is the first generation that discovered they had feelings and were brave enough to explore them. I would imagine in a gloomy town like Aberdeen or Monte, where Kurt spent his teen years, he wouldn't be the only teenager exploring darkness. However, he might be one whose family's history involved either suicide. I don't want to get into that here, but this speaks more of an ancestral trauma that would hopefully be healed through the next generation of his lineage. As I understand, Kurt has wanted children, or perhaps that was this internal understanding in him to continue his family line that would be brave and courageous enough to heal those ancient pains that run through the veins of his family tree and pain. I do think his family life has become rather unfair. Kurt was a teenager, heartbroken by his parents' divorce. A few years prior, like any teenager, he rebelled. However, I think that punishment for his rebellion that came from his father's fears of losing his wife rather than attempting to connect with Kurt and to discipline him. Excuse me. And around the time Kurt was 14, he was moved down to the basement. The years actually not his north node, but the transiting north node was in Leo, moving for his 12th house of isolation and imprisonment and loneliness. His friends that he had at the time do report that he isolated himself and found a whole new adventure in cannabis. What does raise my alarms around his family home is that Dawn mentioned that the family would bribe him to do chores with Kurt's allowance, and then when he didn't do the chores, Kurt would owe them money. That doesn't sound like a very healthy dynamic to me, so the nodes are coming to the square with his natal nodes and creating a crisis in his life story. And I think the crisis was the feeling that he can't depend on anyone but himself. So on the 20th of February 1981, Kurt's 14th birthday, his uncle gives him an electric guitar, and it was the air that he breathed, apparently. The moon was transiting his stellium in Virgo that day, only 2 nights after the full moon, which is the culmination. And I have a theory that Virgo archetype is related to musical instruments, and mythology confirms that theory. Hermes, or Mercury, created the first musical instrument, right? And on the first day that Mercury, or Hermes, was born, he creates this instrument and gives it to his brother Apollo. To me, like, the instinct to learn musical instruments lays in the relationship between natal moon and natal sun, but also relates to Virgo. Even the glyph kind of looks like a guitar if it was like turned 90 degrees. Anyway. In March 1982, he moved with his grandparents. However, that didn't last long. In the next 4 years of his life, he moved around constantly. What's interesting astrologically is that the North Node is transiting the same Jupiter in Cancer that years ago was transited by Saturn and marked his parents' divorce. I would describe the experience of Rahu in Cancer transit his natal Jupiter as a wound that hasn't fully healed, to be opened and bleeding from another incident. What this incident was, we would probably never find out. As we mentioned previously, Cancer is about our sense of safety, and because of this chart, it's meant to be in the family that feels like community, or a community that feels like family. Kurt started seeking for it in the opposing 5th house, which answers to art, drugs, and even romance. And being that the North Node in Cancer was approaching a trine to Kurt's South Node in Scorpio, we're seeing that placement lit up by his behavior. South Node in Scorpio speaks for the intention to test power in all its forms. From Mark Jones, Healing the Soul. While the individual has experienced the power of larger cosmic forces, both internally and externally, they have also undergone cycles of powerlessness as they're not able to relate to or express such power. This may take the form of lack of money or authority on the material level, or psychological experience of devastation, as prior forms that facilitated conscious expansion seem to disappear, leaving the individual bereft. So according to the accounts of his family and community, Kurt enjoyed pushing boundaries. And this is another snippet from the book, as his teenage years began, he constantly tested his limits, and with so many different parental figures, and none with ultimate authority over him, he eventually wore out his elders. His family painted a picture of a stubborn, obstinate boy who wasn't interested to listen to any adults or interested in working. Was he really that difficult, or was he a normal teenager responding to his circumstances, which were lack of care and caused him to feel wrecked and broken? Sometimes Kurt would stay at his mother's place, but that proved to be difficult due to his mother's single woman lifestyle. So on 29th of March 1983, Kurt travels to Seattle to see his first concert ever. Later in life, and in interviews, he claims that he saw the punk band Black Flag, but different accounts claim that his first concert was actually Quarter Flash, which I haven't heard about before, but they're pretty great. Nice 80s band. It's hard to tell what the truth is, or if it's somewhere in the middle, but what is clear is that the music, the lights, the crowd of his first concert experience left an impression on him. Venus, planet of beauty and art and love, was transiting his natal North Node, our obsessions and evolutionary potential of the ego, or the futures of the moon's intentions of the native. In Taurus relates to building something of beauty and something tangible in the real world. In that sense, the concert possibly woke up in Kurt the vision, or even a dream that was dormant inside of him and was ready to come out. Well, Saturn was headed towards his South Node in the 3rd house, indicating the blockage and restrictions he was about to face for the next couple of years on his path towards artistic success. The progress sun was transiting his natal Mercury at the time, and it symbolizes a spark of a big idea that is injected into him on that day and is waiting to be released from mercurial tasks, like making music, combining words into poetry and lyrics, etc. I don't have the exact date for it, but the same summer, Kurt saw Melvin's live for the very first time. And that day he wrote in his journal, "This is what I was looking for. I came to the promised land of a grocery store parking lot and found my special purpose." As if his artistic and creative compass has finally led him to the kind of art his soul longed to create. That summer, his progress sun reaches his natal Mercury exactly, and his progress moon ingress Pisces and transits his natal sun. Years later, Kurt signs in his hit song, The Heart-Shaped Box, "She eyes me like a Pisces when I'm weak." His lyrics and art resonate with the collective in a way as if he is extracting words and music from the heart of the collective consciousness, which is the Pisces archetype. His ability to imagine in places like Aberdeen and Monte, where dreams and hopes come to die, display the Piscean ability to play with real and imagined, to create something completely new and unique. As we continue to trace Kurt's progress moon, the following year, progress moon approaches a progress sun. It's a new moon within the psyche. Insemination of an idea, insemination of some sort, of a new life. At 17, Kurt gets kicked out of his house by his mother. By that time, he fully moved back in with her, I think, for a couple of years. And the pain and isolation that such a drastic decision would create for a young man is hard to imagine. We don't have the exact date for this event, thus can only rely on the progressed planets for interpretation. But the fact remains that due to his mother's own confusion and cruelty towards her son, Kurt becomes homeless. And the new moon marks the beginning of a new Piscean life where his imagination and creativity rescue him from the crude reality. He continued to scatter from place to place, from relative to a friend, even coming back to his father's house temporarily, but instead of finding embrace and love there, Kurt found heavier restrictions that he had long outgrown. So, December 1985. Kurt's first band, Fecal Matter, recorded its first tape. The other band member was Dale Crover, currently the drummer for Melvin's, and was Nirvana's drummer until 1990s. I think he swapped between two bands, but he was always original. I believe he was always in the Melvins. So he featured on the songs. This became tangible proof for Kurt that being a musician is a possibility, and Kurt was experiencing his first nodal return. And I want to draw attention back to the nodes. We looked at them briefly a couple of times, but I think an in-depth analysis will help us understand this native's motivations better. Excuse me, I think I need to sneeze. Didn't happen. In evolutionary astrology, there's something called the evolutionary axis, which is identified by the analysis on the native's Pluto placement and the nodal placements and their relationship to one another. In my understanding, in my mythological understanding, Pluto is the placement that presents the dragon, simultaneously one that guards the treasures from the potential thieves, but also stands as a guardian at the threshold between our shallow understanding of ourselves and our deeper desires. Pluto is the dragon within that we must face if we want to achieve wholeness in this incarnation. And there's a lot that can be said about Pluto in the first house. One thing for sure is that life's darkness is not a stranger to these souls, and oftentimes they wear it proudly on their sleeves too. They are the reminders that we're in constant dance between life and death. They recognize that everything has its ending and beginning, and they're not afraid of that. Instead, they often relish in the fear of those who shy away from the subject of impermanence. Art. So, making each individual unique and a unique expression of the cosmos. But I have a friend, and she's a visual artist, and I would call her one of the most kindest and compassionate people I've ever met. But with Pluto in the first house, she loves to paint on animal skulls. And she would paint flowers, and then she would paint in pastels, like just as a reminder that there's beauty in endings of all things. And it's the beginning of something different. And I had another friend, and he went for a lot as a child. I was going to go into that. I don't think I'm going to go into that. But what I will say is that he did grow up to have a dark sense of humor. And going back to Kurt, he walked the edge of the uncomfortable. His whole life and his art, sense of humor, and music, like what made others cringe, Kurt ran towards that. And as many people with Pluto in the first house, he delighted in others. It's true that the fascination with a dark lore is part of Plutonian personality. On the other hand, Pluto in the first can be used as a shield that protects one from delving deeper into their emotional world. Ironically, Pluto's sphere of operation. Despite that, Pluto in the first house is on a mission to reveal the wounds in the human soul. It might not be his job to heal those wounds, but you cannot heal until you know what you're healing, and humanity is in dire need of those who shine light on our pain. And there's another obvious difference between having Pluto in Scorpio or Leo in the first house and being an early part of Gen X generation. I suppose he's not an early part, but still being part of that generation and having Pluto in Virgo. Virgo is designed to identify flaws, to perfect, to chisel out the excess, to refine, making Virgo the master craftsman of the zodiac. The downside of having Pluto in Virgo, especially in the first, is the constant self-study, the never-ending expectation from the self to be perfect, and realizing that one is merely human. And that kind of weight of self-judgment can be crippling. So what is the deepest soul desire when we, then with the Virgo Pluto placement? Perhaps it's the need to accept yourself. Not necessarily as a flawed human being, although that's part of it, but as a human being. And he will constantly strive to be better, and knowing that that's okay as long as it doesn't become an obsession. Accepting yourself is not as worse than others, but as human as others. Realizing that we all make mistakes, and some of those are darker than other mistakes, but into service instead of self-punishment. Helping people in need, and through that, building up confidence in yourself, that what you do does matter. And having Uranus as well so close to Pluto, that's like throwing kerosene into already burning fire. Stephen Forrest calls this combination explosive. Here are some of the examples he's using in like metaphors or analogies, I suppose it's a better way to describe it. One is 3 shots of tequila followed by an unpremeditated marriage proposal. 2, waking up with a tattoo. And 3, frying the boss and walking out without a career. In other words that we have already discussed. So anyway, sorry. The other word that we already discussed about his Uranus is genius. So we won't go deeply into it. But if Pluto represents the raw evolutionary concern of the soul, then this native, it might be to explore uncomfortable realities. Pluto, in an unexpected and inventive manner. Uranus, for refined and well-crafted art form. Virgo, ruled by Mercury, again Virgo, who's opposing Pluto pretty much directly in this chart and creating a stellium with Chiron, Venus, and even Saturn. This emphasizes the need in Kurt to get lost in his mind, in his ideas, and the difficulty he had to ground and come back to a tangible world. One can say he preferred to live in the abstract rather than the real. So let's see how these definitions tie together with the nodes. While Pluto is evolutionary desires of the soul, the nodes represent the evolutionary potential of the ego. This is from Mark Jones. In Mark Jones' words, the south node of the moon represents the history of the ego, and the north node represents the intended future of the ego. However, I do have to mention that what I've also learned from the Jyotish astrology about the nodes, or as the Jyotish call them, Rahu and Ketu. Jyotish deem both Rahu and Ketu as dangerous if not balanced out by the other. And that's why it's important not just to blindly follow your north node, but also notice the call of your south node. So Kurt's south node is positioned in the third house ruled by Mercury in the sign of Scorpio, and just like in his Pluto placement, again, we are ruled by Pluto and Mars, while the third house is ruled by Mercury. This doesn't just emphasize his soul motivations, it is a clue that this soul came into this incarnation as Kurt, or perhaps his mind was disturbed by dark events that he had to witness, and perhaps in another incarnation, Kurt tried to get humanity to see the darkness he was witnessing, but to no avail. So Kurt's soul was skilled in speaking, seeing, and voicing the truth, Scorpio. And nothing but the truth would satisfy. That is again emphasized by Mars being in his third house of the mind as well. But what did the ego want? Kurt's north node, or Rahu, is in the ninth house, Taurus. I think what he ultimately was seeking was peace amongst the chaos, self-reliance that would eliminate the chaos altogether. He was looking to learn that he can depend on himself despite his earlier experiences. And while the ruler of his Rahu is in Venus in the seventh house in conjunction with Saturn, Chiron and Mercury, it is safe to say that Kurt often looked for internal peace outside of himself, specifically in women in his life. It is not to say that there was anything wrong with the women around him, although the one that raised him has played her cosmic part in creating that chronic wound and damage in him. It is rather to say that no man or woman is an island, and we must seek stillness internally. As Kurt's 27th year approached and Saturn was returning in his chart, I think he began to realize that he couldn't rely on the feminine outside of himself for that ground and peace that he was looking for. And unfortunately, his psyche couldn't handle that reality. And if he would have stuck around, there's a great potential, Saturn return years, and for blooming of his Rahu in Taurus. But that is not how Kurt chose to write his story, and we have to respect that. So, something Kurt said, the most exciting time for a band is right before they become really popular. And by the time Nirvana played Smells Like Teen Spirit for the first time, the band was already an established band, and Kurt has already signed with a label. But Smells Like Teen Spirit was a massive success. I just want to note that in Heavier Than Heaven, Kurt, that I keep mentioning, Cross mentioned that around 1990s to 1991, Kurt kept refining lyrics to all his songs, and Smells Like Teen Spirit had a dozen different versions, relates to the evolutionary axis we just spoke about. On the 13th of September 1991 at 6 p.m., Kurt, Chris, and Dave attended their second album release, and Dave Grohl by the time joined the band, the legendary Nevermind. Kurt decided to start a food fight with Chris, and the band got kicked out of the venue, out of their own party. But the party went on without them, apparently. But that album and Smells Like Teen Spirit music video both changed everything. Nirvana was everywhere, and no one could hide from them, not even Kurt. The party and Nirvana's concert at the party were legendary because the room was filled with music producers, some musicians, and people in the industry in general. The word was out that Nirvana wasn't just speaking to a punk generation. Nirvana was one for the history books that made good art and played good music. In these charts, you can see that Mercury in Virgo is opposing Kurt's progressed Mercury that went direct a few months ago by progression, Kurt's mind into the mind of many. While the transiting Mercury is transiting Rahu, in Kurt's fifth, this success inspiring him to keep creating, his progressed Mercury is transiting Ketu over his moon, representing old feelings that the fame and popularity brought him. And the date I want to focus on next is a couple of weeks later, the 24th of September 1991, post-album release. And the date of the release of the Smells Like Teen Spirit music video. Mercury, the ruler of Kurt's first, was transiting Kurt's AC and Pluto to a degree. The same one we opened this podcast with. While his progressed Mercury has gone direct only a couple of months before, around when Kurt was writing Teen Spirit, as if Mercury himself was rewarding Kurt for his meticulous work with the lyrics, with the music, and with the visual arts, because the music video, most of it was Kurt's ideas. When we look at the third house that's ruled by Mercury, Pluto is transiting natal Neptune there, and Neptune is not only arts and delusion, but it is also is regarded as a planet that rules the media and being able to reach the masses. And note, I did not use the word fame. Pluto, he is releasing Kurt's inner world and deepest desires to the world, and they happen to correlate with the desires of the masses, and that's true art. Neptune. Danny Goldberg's, the band's manager, wrote a biography on Kurt called Serving the Servant. And in it he writes, over the next several years, Kurt usually downplayed his lyrics. He would say he saved fragments of his poetry that were thrown together at the last minute, and sometimes claimed that he didn't BS to me. Anytime I visited Kurt, he was surrounded by notebooks. He reworked lyrics with the same intensity that he brought to recording the music. I think he was just irritated by what he saw as a simplistic attempt to explain a poetic art form. Fair enough, Kurt. Fair enough. Now, let's move on to the love chapter. Puns. Excuse me. But Kurt and Courtney met on January 12, 1990 for the first time. They locked eyes, and within mere moments of meeting one another, the two began to wrestle on the floor. And even though that meeting didn't result in them dating, it began a nearly 2-year-long flirtation between the two. On one hand, when you look at this chart of their meeting, like I think on one hand, Kurt wanted to sexually dominate Courtney, like having Saturn, Mercury retrograde there in Neptune, all transiting his fifth house Capricorn. And his comments to Michael Lazard in an interview later on in life was his admission to wanting to get physical with Courtney that night. And the fifth house is the house of romance and flings, and it is not always the case. But having Capricorn there in the fifth, ruled by Saturn, these natives either seek out serious relationships or try to turn flings into serious relationships, or both. And Kurt's Saturn is in the seventh house of committed relationships as well. So there's that. What really stands out for me in this chart is Chiron transiting Kurt's natal moon, and Courtney's natal sun and moon are not far away as well. So let's talk about the Cancer Capricorn axis, and I call them the father-mother axis, or the parental axis. I think maybe someone else called them too. It might not be my idea. They don't have to represent your biological parents, but they do represent the people that raised you. They also represent the need for a mother and a father figure, and as much as I see sexual, even romantic tension in this Chiron, this Chiron represents the wound that both Kurt and Courtney carry, and the need to heal that mother wound through a relationship. They are both highly sensitive people, and their sensitivities are just expressed differently. And the fact that Kurt's Chiron is near trining the transiting Chiron, he really saw in Courtney, even if unconsciously, a potential to heal. And he probably even considered her as a mother of his future child, which she later became. This Chiron also represents the wounds that they would create in each other as both young and traumatized people. And when I say he saw her as a mother of a child, like I'm saying unconsciously, I'm not saying that was a conscious decision or choice. So according to Danny Goldberg, Kurt finally connected on the 12th of October 1991. And the first night they spent together. That day, Courtney broke up with Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, or he broke up with her regardless. Courtney decided to go for the guy she was really interested in for years, and as history tells, Kurt was really interested in Courtney as well. In the chart for this date, here again, we see Kurt's moon light up by a transiting south node, indicating that the relationship with Courtney has a sense of familiarity for them, at least for him. There's also a study done by Carl Gustav Jung on couples whose moon and sun are in conjunction for synastry, and his findings show that these relationships last longer. And don't take that as a rule. Please don't take that as a rule. To justify someone else's like less than dignified behavior towards you. Just because the stars are saying it doesn't mean you need it, like it needs to last. And you can always find another person with whom you have that synastry. So no excuses for bad relationship behaviors in astrology, please. So Courtney has both moon and the sun in Cancer in her natal chart, and Kurt has the moon in Cancer. The sun person usually becomes slightly more dominant, and as their relationship progressed and Kurt's addiction spiraled into constant near overdoses, Courtney had to become an adult in the relationship, despite struggling with addiction herself, and sometimes he's caretaker as well. So from Serving the Servant here, Danny Goldberg states that Courtney, was more interested in the music business than Kurt, and asked questions that he was hesitant to pose, like especially those regarding the band's compensation. Kurt loved how outspoken Courtney was, so she spoke for him, and he really enjoyed that because he needed that, I think, and he was looking for that throughout his life. So on 24th of February, just 4 days after his birthday, 92, Kurt and Courtney got married in Hawaii. What's interesting is that Venus is in Aquarius again, just like she was the day that the two have met, and Kurt's progress moon was transiting his 10th house, Gemini, opposing transiting moon in Sagittarius. And as the lore goes, the relationship between Love and Cobain became just as popular, or I suppose infamous, as Nirvana's music. And Gemini actually often refers to small chat and sometimes gossip. So that's to speak on that experience. And the last chart we're going to look at, but I don't want to focus on it too much, because I think with Kurt Cobain's story, oftentimes we put too much focus into, well, what happened? Like, why did he pass away the way he did? What's the truth behind it? Without really focusing on the man and the talent. And I think it's a shame. I think it's a shame because he left the world the way he did, and there should be no judgment around that. And it's not an encouragement on anyone either. It does show a lot of pain that he was in, but I want to know only a couple of things in his passing. So we don't actually know exactly when he passed, because they lost track of him for I would say a couple of days. If you don't know the story of the lore, so what happened is both Courtney and Kurt went into rehab, and and they went to different places, and Kurt ran away from his rehab, and those rehabs were in LA. The house was investigation I think assumes that, so he was found on Thursday, that he passed away on Tuesday morning. And the one thing that I want to mention about this is the reappearance of Jupiter in this chart. It's transiting his south node, and oftentimes in the ending of life charts, you can see Jupiter making transits to these big placements, and this placement, as we have observed, has played a huge role in his mindset and his psyche. So I feel like that is partially giving in to these south node thoughts and torments that he potentially went through. And then it's trining that Mercury as well, and Mercury is the psychopomp of, in Greek mythology, of the one that takes people through the river Styx into the underworld. The progressed moon as well, here coming back into Cancer, and again trining that Jupiter in the south node. So the feelings and the intensity of emotions have perhaps overtaken this native and the soul, and he did what he knew how to do. It didn't come out right. I think he did the best he could until the moment that he couldn't, and I think that is to say the most about that. You can see this transit in the Cancer house and these Jupiter transit throughout his life, with the loss of, in a way, a loss of his father, which was a loss of his father, a divorce, a breakup of the family, of the union, and then the coming together with Courtney and the emotional turmoil that they both created in each other. And there's nothing bad to say about Courtney. It's just that I feel like when two traumatized people, especially when they're young, and when trauma is not really a thing, no one's really talking about it, they don't really know what to do, they're both struggling with addiction. As much as they want to do good for one another, as much as they want to try and heal, they inadvertently will create more wounds, even when they don't want to. So I can see those things there. And on that note, I want to end this with some of Danny Goldberg's words about Kurt's passing. There are mysteries of the mind and spirit. With the possible exception of saints, human beings simply aren't designed to understand everything about life and death. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you found it useful. Let me know if you want me to do more chart readings like this. But for now, I'm a little bit exhausted from talking. I'm gonna go and try and be quiet for a few minutes. And yeah, and thank you, Kurt, for the amazing art that you've created for us and for leaving behind your legacy. I think a lot of people are really appreciative of it, more than the soul realizes. Not the soul, that soul. So with immense gratitude and immense inspiration, I will leave you guys here. I do feel tired and inspired, so may you all be well, may you all be happy. And that's all she wrote.